Something is happening across the entire Western world simultaneously, and the explanation you're being offered for it isn't the real one. Property has become unaffordable for anyone under 40. Inflation is quietly consuming the purchasing power of working people, while official statistics describe a healthy economy. The stock market keeps climbing, while actual productive economic activity stagnates. Quality of life for young people is measurably worse than it was for their parents at the same age. Public and private debt has reached levels that previous generations would have considered catastrophic. Governments, when confronted with these realities, don't acknowledge them, they reframe them, deny them, or redirect attention elsewhere. And running underneath all of it, a current of mass immigration reshaping the demographic composition of Western societies at a pace with no historical precedent. These aren't random events. They aren't the coincidental byproducts of unconnected policy failures. The question that unlocks the pattern isn't what is happening, it's who benefits. Before we get to the answer that actually fits the data, let's honestly survey the theories that are currently competing for your attention, because some of them have real explanatory power, even if none of them is complete. Neoliberalism as a framework argues that the ideological capture of economic policy by a single metric, growth, always growth, growth as the universal solvent that dissolves all social problems, has hollowed out everything that markets weren't designed to optimize. When GDP becomes the only number that matters, the things that don't show up in GDP, community cohesion, environmental health, generational equity, the texture of daily life for ordinary people gets systematically degraded because nobody in the decision-making structure is accountable for them. Techno-feudalism is a more recent framework built around the observation that a small number of technology platforms have achieved a kind of territorial control over economic life that resembles in its structural dynamics the feudal arrangements of medieval Europe. You don't own your digital existence. You rent access to it from entities that set the terms unilaterally, extract value from your activity, and can revoke your participation without appeal. If you don't own property, you're economically dependent in a way that makes you manageable in ways that property owners simply aren't. The world government theory, circulating in various forms across the political spectrum, points to supranational institutions coordinating policy across nominal democracies in ways that bypass the populations those democracies are supposed to represent. The argument is that national sovereignty has become a performance while actual decisions get made in rooms that no electorate voted for. Population replacement theory makes a more specific and more politically charged claim that the demographic transformation of Western societies through immigration is not primarily an economic or humanitarian policy, but a management strategy. The argument runs that populations with deep cultural commitments to individual rights, free speech, and democratic accountability are difficult to govern in ways that consolidate power. Replacing them gradually with populations from traditions less culturally primed for confrontation with authority produces a more tractable citizenry. And then there's simple bureaucratic incompetence, the theory that resists conspiratorial frameworks entirely and attributes the dysfunction to nothing more sinister than the ordinary human tendency towards self-preservation, institutional inertia, and the inability of complex systems to self-correct once they've optimized for the wrong things. All of these frameworks capture something real. All of them have evidence, and all of them feel slightly incomplete when you test them against the full scope of what's happening. Here's why. They focus on mechanisms and ideologies, but they don't tell you whose interests are being consistently served. Apply the oldest analytical tool in political economy. Follow the benefit. Take every major trend reshaping Western societies right now and ask concretely, who gets better off when this happens. Property prices rising, someone owns that property and watches their balance sheet expand. Stock market valuations detaching from economic fundamentals, someone holds those stocks. Healthcare systems buckling under demand, someone is ahead in the queue. Mass immigration, bringing in workers willing to accept conditions that domestic workers have historically organized against. Someone needs those workers and doesn't want to pay the price that a tight labor market would otherwise demand. When you run this analysis across every trend simultaneously, a pattern emerges with uncomfortable consistency. The demographic group that benefits most comprehensively across the widest range of these trends is wealthy, elderly people. Not elderly people as a whole. There are plenty of old people who are poor and struggling, and the analysis doesn't implicate them. But the specific intersection of old and wealthy captures the group whose portfolio of interests aligns most precisely with the policy outcomes we're actually observing. Rising property values serve people who bought property decades ago and own multiple properties. Rising stock market valuations serve people who have been accumulating equity for 40 years. Mass immigration of young workers serves people in their 70s and 80s who need domestic labor, healthcare workers, and service providers. Euthanasia policy expanding access serves people who are consuming healthcare intensively and are aware at some level that the system's capacity is under strain. Inflation and slow real growth don't particularly hurt people whose wealth is already accumulated, and government unwillingness to honestly acknowledge systemic problems protects the political arrangements that keep wealth concentrated where it currently sits. This isn't a conspiracy theory in the sense of requiring secret coordination in hidden rooms. It's the predictable aggregate outcome of a large number of people with similar interests making individually rational decisions within systems that give their preferences disproportionate weight. The demographic reality underlying all of this is something humanity has genuinely never encountered before. For the entire span of human history, up until about 50 years ago, the distribution of ages in any given society looked roughly like a pyramid. Many young people at the base, fewer middle-aged people in the middle, very few old people at the top. Old age was rare. The combination of high infant mortality, shorter adult lifespans, and the accumulated physical wear of pre-industrial labor meant that surviving into your 80s was exceptional rather than typical. Social institutions, economic structures, political systems, all of these were built around a world where old people were scarce and young people were abundant. That world is gone. Medical technology, improved nutrition, sanitation infrastructure, and the shift away from physically destructive labor have extended human lifespans in ways that the architects of modern social contracts never anticipated. People who were supposed to retire at 65 and collect pensions for 7 or 8 years before dying are instead retiring at 65 and living for another 25 or 30 years. The entire actuarial foundation of pension systems was built on mortality assumptions that no longer hold. The numbers make this concrete. In the United States alone, the population over 65 is projected to reach 65 million by 2040. The population over 85, the oldest old, the most resource-intensive segment, the most politically conservative, and the most entrenched in established power structures will reach 15 million. And these aren't people sitting quietly in retirement homes waiting for the end. These are people with investment portfolios, property holdings, political connections, and decades of accumulated leverage in every institution of consequence. Meanwhile, the ratio of workers to retirees, the fundamental arithmetic that determines whether pension systems remain solvent, has deteriorated past the point of sustainability. The healthy ratio is roughly 3 workers supporting every retiree. We are well past that point in most Western nations, and the trajectory is getting worse, not better. Pension funds that were designed around certain return assumptions and certain mortality curves are now operating in a reality that violates both assumptions simultaneously. They're taking losses they were never designed to absorb while paying out to more retirees for longer than any model predicted. And if you want to understand why money keeps flowing out of pension funds into investment bank products that don't serve pensioners' interests, the explanation is straightforward. Pension fund management is not where the most talented financial minds go to work. It is by the assessment of the finance industry itself, where financial careers go to plateau. The people designing sophisticated instruments on the other side of these transactions are operating at a different level than the people on the pension fund side trying to evaluate them. The predictable outcome of systematically putting the best financial minds against the least sophisticated institutional buyers is that wealth transfers from the latter to the former, and the pensioners whose retirements depend on those funds absorb the loss. This brings us to gerontocracy, rule by the old, which has stopped being a theoretical concern and become a description of current reality. The two most powerful political figures in the United States for a substantial period of recent history were both in their 80s while exercising that power. This is not exceptional in the current political landscape. It's representative. The Senate of the United States, the institution that confirms judges, ratifies treaties, and shapes legislation affecting 330 million people, has a median age that sits above the standard retirement threshold of most Western countries. Senators in their 90s have refused to leave office and have been carried through their terms by institutional inertia and the sheer reluctance of power to acknowledge physical limitation. One died in office at 90. Others have experienced visible neurological episodes in public settings that would end careers in virtually any other professional context. This matters beyond the obvious concern about individual cognitive capacity. It matters because of what age does to political psychology. The political psychology literature on aging is fairly consistent about the trajectory. Young people in public life tend toward disruption, challenging existing arrangements, tolerating uncertainty, prioritizing possibility over stability. This isn't naivety, it's the rational orientation of someone whose future is long and whose current arrangements are constraining. Middle-aged political actors tend toward gradualism, preferring managed change, seeking consensus, protecting gains while building incrementally. Again, rational given the position, significant skin in the existing game, still enough future ahead to care about outcomes. But very old political actors, particularly those who have spent their entire adult lives accumulating power within specific institutional arrangements, tend towards something harder. Not conservatism in the ideological sense, but reactivity in the psychological sense. The instinct to resist change, to treat any disruption of familiar arrangements as a threat rather than an opportunity, to prioritize safety and continuity over any other value. Combined with the specific interests outlined above, this produces a governing class that is systematically oriented against the interests of everyone who is young. What does a world shaped by gerontocratic interests actually look like in practice? Not in theory, but in the specific texture of daily life. It looks like surveillance expanding because elderly people who by statistical reality are more likely to be crime victims than perpetrators prioritize security over privacy. The monitoring infrastructure that now covers public space in most major Western cities, the legislation criminalizing online speech that would have been protected expression a generation ago, the expansion of police authority into areas of life that were previously considered private, all of. This is easier to push through a political system whose active participants skew heavily old. It looks like digital currency replacing cash, framed as convenience and modernization, but functioning as financial surveillance. Cash is anonymity. Cash is the ability to transact outside the monitored system. Eliminating cash means every economic decision you make becomes a data point in a system you don't control and can't opt out of. The people who benefit from this are the people who want to know and potentially restrict what you do with money. It looks like endless immigration pipelines filling the labor roles that an aging domestic population can no longer fill, and a domestic young population is no longer willing to fill at the wages being offered. Nurses for the aged care facilities, domestic workers for the homes of wealthy retirees, construction workers for the infrastructure maintenance that accumulated deferred investment now requires. The framing is humanitarian. The function is labor supply management in the interests of people who need that labor. It looks like prison populations serving as a labor force under conditions that private employers could never legally impose. Prisons in the current Western model are expensive to run, politically convenient to expand, and function as both a containment mechanism for populations that gerontocratic governance has failed economically and a source of labor that doesn't negotiate. And it looks like war, perpetual, low-grade, strategically questionable military engagement that consumes the young men and women who might otherwise be directing their energy and frustration at the domestic political arrangements that have failed them. The oldest and most reliable social pressure valve in the history of civilization redirect the anger outward before it organizes inward. None of the individual theories surveyed at the beginning of this analysis is wrong. Neoliberalism is real. Techno-feudalism is real. Supranational coordination is real. Demographic replacement as a management strategy has genuine evidence behind it. Bureaucratic incompetence is real and does enormous damage. But these are all instruments. They're mechanisms through which something more fundamental is expressing itself. The more fundamental reality is that power, concentrated in the hands of a specific demographic cohort that has more resources, more institutional leverage, more political participation, and more accumulated claim on every system that matters than any comparable cohort in human history is. Behaving exactly as power always behaves, protecting and extending itself. The specific novelty of the current moment is that this cohort is, for the first time, also running out of time in the most literal biological sense. And power running out of time doesn't relax gracefully. It tightens. It surveils. It restricts. It imports the labor it needs to maintain its comfort. It sends the young to wars it designs but doesn't fight. It administers systems it knows are mathematically insolvent and leaves the reckoning for whoever is standing after it's gone. The pension funds will not be there for you. Not in any form resembling what they represented for the generation that designed them. The mathematics of too many retirees drawing too long from pools fed by too few workers is not a political problem that can be voted away. It's an arithmetic problem, and arithmetic doesn't negotiate. The property market will not correct itself back to the ratios that allowed previous generations to build equity through ordinary employment. The wealth that's been built on rising valuations over 40 years has been built on your inability to enter the same market on equivalent terms. That's not an accident. That's the intended function of a system optimized for the people who already own everything. So what do you do with this? The first thing is to see it clearly. The frameworks being offered, left versus right, globalism versus nationalism, urban versus rural, are real disagreements with real stakes, but they also function as a way of keeping the generational dimension out of focus. When the young argue among themselves about ideological questions, the gerontocracy doesn't have to defend itself. Divide the young, direct their energy toward each other, and the arrangement that's taken from all of them remains invisible. The second thing is to understand that this analysis doesn't make old people the enemy. It makes a specific configuration of concentrated power and concentrated self-interest the problem. Old people who are poor are not the beneficiaries of this system. They're its victims alongside everyone else who doesn't own substantial assets. The target isn't an age group, it's an arrangement. The third thing, and this requires some patience with a very long timeline, is to recognize that the gerontocracy is consuming itself. The same dynamic that concentrates power in the old is also consuming the systems the old depend on. The pension funds, the healthcare infrastructure, the political legitimacy required to keep populations sufficiently compliant. These aren't infinite resources. They're being drawn down at rates the underlying systems can't sustain. What comes after will be determined by whether the people currently being filled by these arrangements manage to understand what's happening to them before the bill comes due. The bill is coming regardless. The question is, who shapes what replaces the system that fails? That's not a comfortable thought, but comfortable thoughts haven't been serving you particularly well lately.